Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I want to paint some wildflowers using a different approach to what I'm usually used to. I'm going to paint this freehand and as a full landscape, so I'm going to start off by masking off the sides. For fun, I feel like this would look nice as a double page spread on my square sketchbook, but you can adjust this to fit other sizes as well, just tweak the width slightly. Here's the reference image that I used. It's actually a vertical composition, but I just took the main idea of the textures, types of plants, and colors and tried to apply it into a composition that would fit a double page spread. Next, I'm going to go straight into the colors. This is Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Rose of Ultramarine by Daniel Smith, Terre Verte by Holbein, and Vermilion by Holbein. I'm also going to use Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Okay, let's begin. I'm going to start by painting the first layer. I dampened the whole surface quickly, and this sketchbook has hot press paper, so I just want to lightly dampen the paper without creating too much puddles. Then I mixed up the color of the sky. I want it to be a little bit of a muted orange, so I used Jaune Brilliant Dark with an orange mixture from Permanent Yellow Deep and Vermilion. Then I mute the color slightly with the tiniest bit of Rose of Ultramarine. And as for the darker clouds, I added more Rose of Ultramarine into the mix. While the surface of the sky is still damp, let's paint the mountain at the back. I used a mix of indigo with Rose of Ultramarine, and I added a little bit of that pink from the cloud. I kind of just made up the shape of the mountain so it fits the space that I have. And as you can see, since the background is still a bit damp, the paint is traveling a bit, and if it's traveling too fast, I can just use a clean dry brush to fix the edges. Now let's keep going and paint the mountain in front. For this, I'm using the same mix, but I added a bit more indigo in the ratio as well as Terre Verde this time. I'm also using a slightly thicker consistency, and since the background is a little bit more dry now, the edges are not as blurry as before. I don't want the bottom to have harsh edges, so I used a clean dry brush to smudge the bottom part. Then I felt like darkening the mountain at the back since it was spreading too much and fading, so I just added another layer of the purple. At the bottom, while the surface of the purple is still damp, I'm going to continue it down with the same mixture as the previous grayish mountain. And I'm just making up the shapes as I go to create a background. There's a little bit of an awkward space here, so I'm just going to fill it in with a mix of Terre Verde and Permanent Yellow Deep. This also has a little bit of the gray, so the color stays consistent. Next, I'm going to add more Terre Verde into the ratio, and this will create another tone of green. And in this case, since the bushes are a bit closer to us, I'm going to make it look a bit thicker and in clumps, just like the reference. I feel like I have a decent background now, so I want to start introducing the pastel colors for the wildflowers. I find it easier now to work from the bottom to the top, so I can estimate how much of the foreground should be certain colors. For the first bush, I used a mix of Jaune Brilliant Dark and Rose of Ultramarine. Then on the right, I use the light yellow green from Terre Verde and Permanent Yellow Deep. At this point, I'm not worried about the details. I'm just trying to divide up the space and allocate the areas for certain bushes, which is why I'm still painting lightly. For the third one, I used the first bush mixture with added vermilion, so you can see the color is a bit more pinkish. And for this next one, I first used Jaune Brilliant Dark, and at the bottom, while the surface is still damp, I followed it up by adding some yellow-green. So those are the basic color mixtures. You can play around with the ratio or even just using single colors in order to create variations, or repeat the same mixtures to fill the page. As I get towards the back, I want to somewhat blend the foreground into the background. And since the surface was completely dry by now, I'm just going to dampen it again so it's a bit easier to create a soft blend between the colors, since, as I mentioned before, this is just the base. For a couple of bushes in the foreground, I'm going to darken the bottom ever so slightly. Then after this, I'm going to make sure everything's completely dry before I mask off some flower shapes for a couple of the pink bushes. To make the drying process quicker, I'm just going to use a hair dryer. Then once everything is completely bone dry, not even cold to the touch, I'm going to use my silicone brush to apply the masking fluid on some of the pink bushes. For the first one, I'm painting on circles forming as tiny flower petals. I like to create between 3 to 5 petaled flowers, and I like using scrap paper to put a thick dollop of masking fluid, then pick it up and apply it with my silicone brush so I can control how much I use and create those tiny little shapes. I'm being mindful of the placement, making sure to create height differences so the bush looks like it's naturally grown. And for the second bush here, I'm doing more or less the same thing, but I'm taking more masking fluid on my silicone brush so the flower petals are thicker and bigger. So those are the base, and I'm going to start working on the details, focusing on one bush at a time. I like to slightly dampen the surface of the section of the bush I'd like to work on. For this first one, I use permanent yellow deep with Terre, Verte and a little bit of indigo to create a light yellow green that I applied with a smaller brush. Then I'm going to add some shadows in between by adding more indigo in the mix to darken the green. For the top part of this grass, I'm going to use a thick consistency of Jaune Brilliant Dark, making sure that the surface is still damp when I'm applying this so the top part of the grass looks fuzzy. Then in between the Jaune Brilliant Dark, I like to use a thick consistency of a light yellow green for a slightly darker value. Here for the lightest colors that is almost opaque, I used a mix of Jaune Brilliant Dark and Bleed Proof White so it looks like the lighter grass is in front. While I wait for this section to dry, I'm going to move on to the bush on the right hand side. I'm going to create a similar texture on the damp surface, but this time I'm using a light pink color. The pink mix is mostly from Jaune Brilliant Dark, a little bit of vermilion and a tiny bit of rose of ultramarine. And as for the green grass, I used the same yellow-green mix but with added Jaune Brilliant Dark. As for the darker value of the grass, this time though I added some rose of ultramarine so it looks muted and slightly gray. Here I'm creating a pink from Bleed Proof White, Rose of Ultramarine, and Vermilion to create a different type of fuzzy grass. I'm still painting this on a damp surface, by the way, and this time I'm following the lines that I've painted earlier to paint more short lines or ovals growing in the direction of the curved base. And I like to randomize the textures so they look more natural. You can see that the color is very light here, so I'm going to pair this up with a darker value. So this is the same mixture, it just has more Rose of Ultramarine and Vermilion. Let's move on to the next flower bush. I started out by dampening the surface, and this time I'm going to use a mix of orange from Vermilion and Permanent Yellow Deep with added Rose of Ultramarine, which will come to this dark muted color, which I'm going to place at the bottom. Since the surface was fairly damp, you can see that the colors are spreading quite a lot, and it's also becoming lighter and lighter as it dries. So I paired it up with a darker value, which is from the same mix with added indigo. You can see I've left the top part with the base color, which is the light pink. Then I'm going to move on to the next bush on top, starting with the light yellow green from indigo, bit of yellow, and Jaune Brilliant Dark. Then for the next bush behind, I follow it up with a thin consistency of indigo before adding a thicker consistency at the bottom to separate the sections. Now going back to the green bush, I added some Terre Verde to the indigo and some rose of ultramarine, and I'm going to place this darker value on the still damp surface. Since I applied a really thick consistency, some edges look kind of harsh, so I used a clean damp brush to soften some of them and randomize the texture. Let's move on to the next area behind. I just used the greens that I've already premixed on my palette, and then I added some vermilion and permanent yellow deep using a thick consistency and a darker value to separate this section from the fuzzy grass in front. Since this area is quite big, I tried to separate the depth by sectioning out the darker values. Then on top of those lines, making sure that I'm still working on the damp surface, I'm going to add some white fluffy flowers using bleed-proof white. To apply the paint, I kind of just twirl my brush randomly to create textures that is somewhat rounded, but also randomized by playing with the height. Since part of the stems are covered by the white, I'm going to add more, and this time I'm using a darker value, so this just has a bit more indigo in the mix. And I also made sure that the lines are a little bit finer this time for added detail. I feel like the color was getting a little bit too blue, so I decided to add some vermilion so the color stays nice and muted. I'm using a thick consistency here to paint in between those stems. For the bushes at the back, I'm going to treat it the same way as I did for the previous ones in front of them. And just like before, I always like to use a slightly darker value to separate them from the lighter bushes in front. Whenever I'm adding the darker values to the bushes, I like to take the opportunity to also clear out the edges of the bushes in front of them. Notice how I'm somewhat wiggling my brush in different directions so the top edge of the bush in front looks natural. I'm just going to add an extra one at the back here to break up the background, but I'm basically going to treat it the same way as the other bushes. I'm just going to take off the reference image since I feel like I kind of know what I'm doing now, so I'm just going to make things up as I go. I'm also happy with the color choices I've made, so next I'm going to start painting the second spread using the same technique. For this flower bush, I started by dampening the surface, then I used a mix of Jaune Brilliant and Vermilion and a little bit of Rose of Ultramarine to paint some of the stems on the damp surface. For the darker values, I added more Rose of Ultramarine, and I'm going to mute the color slightly by taking some of the dark green that I've already pre-mixed on my palette. Here I'm using a thick consistency as I'm spreading out those thin lines for the stems, but since the surface is still damp, the color will spread out and fade. Using the same color mixture, I'm going to add more lines, this time on a dry surface using my liner brush for the stems of the pink fuzzy grass on the right hand side. Then I'm going to follow this up by painting more of the pink fuzzy grass on top of those stems using the same color mixture as before. This has more bleed-proof white though, so it looks like these ones are in front of the ones that we previously painted. Next, I'm going to work on the plants behind the pink fuzzy grass, and you can see that there isn't a good enough separation, so I took a darker version of the pink with added Rose of Ultramarine to paint a little bit more of these textures behind the lighter pinks that we've previously painted. This can be part of the fuzzy grass as well, but I'm making this more abstract so we can't really see where it ends, and it also looks kind of fuzzy, which is the look that I'm going for. On top, since the surface is still damp, I'm going to follow this up with some bleed-proof white. At first, I used some mix of bleed-proof white with a little bit of Rose of Ultramarine, but I felt like the color was a little bit too dark, so I ended up just using bleed-proof white by itself. As for the stem, I'm going to use a light muted green color, or any of the greens that you've already pre-mixed, since there's already so many tones of greens that I have access to on my palette. I started out with a thick consistency, but then I realized that it was too strong compared to the white, so I started spreading it out a little bit softer on the damp surface so the paint has a little bit more space to spread. For the color of the stem, you can literally pick any color that would stay consistent to the colors that you've chosen in your composition, and after this I felt like I want to extend those fluffy white flowers, so I'm going to dampen this side on the left, apply bleed proof white on the damp surface, and this time I'm going to use the orangey mix for the stem, but then I'm going to go over it again with a bit of green. I'm just going to add a bit more saturation to this area, and I'm using a yellow-green mixture. You can see that since there's a lot of green tones on my palette, I just add certain colors that would turn whatever is on my palette into the color that I want it to be. So in this case, I just added Permanent Yellow Deep. I still didn't really know what to do with the back here, so I'm going to go back to the flower bush in front. I first dampen the surface, add a bit of that yellow-green, and then I use the thicker consistency to paint more stems with the dark green. I feel like having this green contrast would make the flowers look nicer when I take off the masking fluid. Here I'm also going to add some fine stems using a thick consistency of Rose of Ultramarine. Then I realized I want to add some dark bushes at the back on the right hand side of my spread. I'm going to use this dark green here by adding more indigo. Then I'm going to dry everything off before taking off the masking fluid. Now that we can see the little flowers, I'm going to add more with bleed proof white. I'm going to paint on similar flower shapes to the masked off areas. And these light flowers will look like they're overlapping in front of the previous masked flowers. This time I'm also going to paint on some really fine stems under the flowers, and this will add a really delicate touch. I also intentionally extended the placement of the flowers in front of the green bush behind, so the flowers doesn't just look like a big clump of bush like everything else. This will actually bring a light airiness to the composition. To paint on the really fine stems, I'm using my liner brush just like the flowers, and I like to do this after painting a few flowers since there will be less paint on my bristles. I make sure that it comes to a fine point, and I use a light to dry brush load so the paint doesn't travel too fast out of my bristles. For the larger flowers, to paint on the flowers, I used a larger brush this time so I can make the petals a little bit bigger, but I'm going to treat it more or less the same way as how I did with the previous flower bush. I feel like this area looks pretty empty, but I don't really want to add anything else since I quite like how it looks already, so I'm just using a thin consistency of bleed proof white so it's not too opaque and it's not too overwhelming compared to everything else in the painting, and I just added some faded branches. On this area here, this was quite random, but I wanted to add some leaves that I paint flatly, sort of like a doodle style, again just to fill in the space, and I make sure that the green goes with everything else on this painting. I actually don't mind how this looks because the flowers also look quite flat and stylized anyway, so I feel like it complements the composition in my opinion. And to bring this doodle style across, I decided to add some flat textures on this dark bush and also some leaves on the faded branches that I painted earlier. To make this fluffy white flower bush a little bit different, I decided to add a similar texture to the dark bush, but I'm using bleed-proof white. Lastly, I'm going to add some finishing touches to add a bit more depth to the bushes and a bit more textures here and there just to balance everything out that I've painted so it makes sense all across. Don't be scared to play with other hues as well for the darker values. As an example here, I added some indigo and rose of ultramarine, but I smudged it so it's transparent against the green that I painted earlier as the base. I quite like how everything looks here, so I'm going to unmask the sides, but like usual, once I unmask, I always feel the need to add other adjustments. In this case, I'm going to add a bit more darker values and also add stems to the larger flowers that I've seemed to have forgotten. And that's basically it for this painting. I love how experimental this was for me personally. I also love the color combination of this one. It's actually probably one of my favorites that I've painted so far, so I hope you enjoyed it as well. And if you did or found this tutorial useful, please consider subscribing and leave a comment. It'll really help me out. And yeah, like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!